Today, we're in the White Mountains, home to the highest peak in Nevada.
Hi, I'm Scott Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're in Nevada and headed up Montgomery Peak, the rooftop of the Silver State. But before we start this adventure, take a moment to click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates.
Located on the western side of the state, Montgomery Peak can be found about halfway between Las Vegas and Reno in Esmeralda County, at the far northern end of the White Mountains, a chain of peaks that runs about 60 miles south into California. The White Mountains are named after White Mountain Peak, the highest peak in the range, which in turn is thought to have been named after either the snowfall near its summit or an early assumption that it was made of dolomite, a white sedimentary rock.
This range has some interesting features to it. While you may assume it's part of the Sierra Nevadas to the west, that assumption would be false. It's its own independent range. It's the tallest mountain range completely in the Great Basin Desert. It's also one of the highest and driest desert ranges in North America. White Mountain Peak, the range namesake, is the third tallest mountain in California.
Both the range itself and the land adjacent to it has some rather amazing geology. To the west is Owen Valley, the deepest valley in the United States, and the geographic feature that separates the Whites from the Sierra Nevadas. It makes for a stunning view to see these western peaks only 20 miles away. That short distance has another effect as well. The White Mountains are in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevadas, making them an extremely dry range.
On the eastern side of these mountains lies one of the natural wonders of this country, the Great Basin Desert, covering over 190,000 square miles. It is the largest of the four major deserts in the United States. And Nevada, well, it sits in the very heart of it.
It is the largest endorheic basin, not only in the USA, but also North America, and the ninth largest in the world. An easy way to understand what an endorheic basin is this way. With the exception of, say, evaporation or absorption into the ground, any water that comes into the basin stays in the basin. Doesn't allow any outflow to outside sources like rivers or oceans. The Great Basin Desert is part of the larger Basin and Range Province, a massive geographical region that stretches from southern Idaho all the way down past the Gulf of California on the west side of Mexico.
I've always been intrigued by deserts. There's just something about them that appeals to me. I think part of it's this combination of an inhospitable environment on one hand, and then also a place of this austere natural beauty. And that dynamic makes them these fascinating places. And it's also, things just seem more real in the desert. But it's also a place that can play tricks on the mind. Frankly, the Great Basin is an incredible part of this country. And the name, though, well, that's a bit of a misnomer because it's not just one massive basin. It's actually a bunch of basins and ranges running all the way through it. There are over 300 named mountain ranges that make up the Great Basin. They all run from the north to south. And in effect, with Nevada's location in it, it makes Nevada the most mountainous state in the lower 48.
The Earth's crust is stretched thin here and continues to gradually expand, a process known as tectonic extension, which leads to cracks and faulting. Over the course of millions of years, this has led to the current landscape, with one side rising up to form the mountains, and the other sinking into the basins.
All this geological activity means this area is prone to earthquakes. And it's one of the most seismically active in the entire country. This complex geology, though, has played a key role in Nevada's history, both in the beginning and to this very day.
Despite its stark appearance and dry climate, this place isn't a barren wasteland. Far from it. It has a rich and unique biodiversity, with species and plants found nowhere else. The mountains are oases of life, the cooler temperature allowing for snow to accumulate and then melt to feed the native flora and fauna.
Perhaps the most amazing of all the unique organisms found in this area are here in the ancient bristlecone pine forest. The pine trees in this forest are some of the most ancient living organisms on our entire planet, and the oldest among them can be found in Schulman Grove in the White Mountains.
The Great Basin bristlecone pine is a strange yet remarkable tree, truly capable of surviving in this harsh environment. Its leaves can stay green for up to 45 years. They thrive in soil and rock that other plants can't grow, reducing the risk of forest fire. And then there is the wood itself. The slow rate of growth for the tree means the wood is extremely dense, and that makes it resistant to insects, fungus, and rot. The oldest of them is a tree known as Methuselah, an entity whose lifespan is measured in thousands of years. To provide some perspective on how old this ancient tree is, put it this way: the Great Pyramids of Giza were still centuries away from being built when this tree was first sprouting up from the ground.
You get a sense of just how old this place is. You're just walking through this grove, that these trees, their gnarled, misshapen appearance, have been witness to history. And that long after you and I are gone, this place that's been unchanged for millennia will continue to thrive and grow.
This ecosystem may be rich in biodiversity, but for humans, well, it's a bit more on the inhospitable side. Baking in the summer, freezing in the winter, always dry. It's for these reasons that Nevada was largely left alone from European colonial expansion. Even today, it is still sparsely populated, with less than 800 people residing here in Esmeralda County. That isn't to say this area was uninhabited. Native American tribes are thought to have lived in the region for over 6,000 years, with some discovered artifacts pushing that timeline back even further to 9,000 years ago.
They say that every type of rock known to geologists can be found in this desert landscape. But the knowledge behind this isn't actually anything new. The history of mining in Nevada dates back almost as far as the first findings of human habitation in the state. Thousands and thousands of years ago, Paleo-Americans were digging up obsidian, quartz, jasper, and other minerals to manufacture tools like axe and arrowheads or spear points. Moving even further up the timeline, there's been archaeological findings dating to 300 to 500 AD, showing that the Anasazi people were here doing salt and turquoise mining. Not only were people living here, they were thriving. When later European and then American settlers arrived on the scene, the Native Americans they encountered were the Washoe, the Paiute, and the Shoshone nations.
In the 1700s, the area was nominally claimed by Spain, but the Spanish didn't actually begin to explore this place until 1776, and then it was only to see if it was worth the effort to create an overland trail from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Monterey, California. It wasn't. There are stories that Spanish explorers had discovered and mined emeralds in the area, but those have never been confirmed.
In a bit of naming irony, Boundary Peak is found in Esmeralda County, Esmeralda being Spanish for emeralds. Now, this isn't some confirmation of those earlier Spanish legends of emerald mining in this area, but the name does have a literary bent. What the Esmeralda it's referring to is actually the Romani dancer in Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
The first U.S. pioneer through the area was Jedediah Smith, one of the great American explorers in the first decades of the 19th century. He and his party would be the first U.S. citizens to cross the Mojave Desert, and then later cross the Sierra Nevadas and the Great Basin Desert on their return to the east. Smith's notes, maps, and other documentation would become invaluable to later explorers of the region.
The United States acquired this territory from Mexico with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But even after that, this area remained isolated and rarely traveled. It was always easier to go around the Great Basin than it was to go through it. And if for some reason you did find yourself traveling through here, you did so with haste.
All that was to change in January 1848, when gold was discovered, not here in Nevada, but to the west. The California gold rush changed the face of the country, as hundreds of thousands of people stampeded towards the Pacific to try and strike it rich.
The effects of this were like dominoes falling. The California Trail would bring over 250,000 people through this area. And here in Nevada, the trail would split, with various routes branching off to destinations in California and Oregon. For the Native Americans living here, though, this onslaught of people spelled doom for their way of life. And while in the beginning they were able to resist and defend their homelands with a modicum of success, eventually, though, they were forcibly removed from their lands.
It was during this time that Nevada would get its first permanent U.S. settlement, the community of Genoa, founded in 1858, built up around a Mormon trading post, and it would establish a bit of a trend. As more people arrived and population grew, it would stay centered on the western border, a fact that would hold true until Las Vegas became an entertainment paradise in the latter part of the 20th century.
The California Gold Rush would also lead to a more thorough investigation of Nevada's geological secrets as well. Prospectors had discovered placer gold in the Carson River in 1849. And that was the first clue that perhaps there was more here than meets the eye. Over the next several years, miners would slowly work their way up that river into the Virginia Range. And thereby, they set the stage to jumpstart Nevada's future.
Nevada, in early 1859, was still a remote, sparsely populated, and isolated place. But its secrets couldn't be hidden forever. And, with a bit of digging, everything would change.
Visibly, our new home was a desert, walled in by barren, snow-clad mountains. There was not a tree in sight, There was no vegetation but the endless sagebrush and greasewood. All nature was gray with it. We were plowing through great depths of powdery alkali, dust that rose in thick clouds and floated across the plain like smoke from a burning house.
That's how American author Mark Twain described coming to western Nevada in 1860 in his classic Roughing It. To me, it paints a pretty bleak picture, but it also reveals the allure of this place, that people were willing to flock here to an inhospitable and isolated region to chase after their dreams of silver.
The Nevada we know today had its genesis from one major event, the Comstock Lode. It was the first major discovery of silver in the United States, and it kicked off a silver rush, at times comparable to the California gold rush over a decade earlier. The Comstock Lode would revolutionize the mining industry and would put Nevada on the path to statehood and give it its nickname, the Silver State.
At the time of the Silver Strike, Nevada was still part of the larger Utah Territory, but several factors would come into play that would shape Nevada into the state that we know today. The first, and at the time for the U.S. government, most pressing concern was the Mormons.
The Mormons' relationship with the United States government, to put it mildly, was fraught and filled with mistrust. The practitioners of Mormonism had originally fled west in the earlier part of the 19th century to escape violence against their religious beliefs. They had ended up in Utah and established a settlement at what is now Salt Lake City. By 1860, the U.S. government had concerns about Mormon loyalty. It was only a few years prior that the Utah War had been settled, with the U.S. Army marching into Utah Territory to enforce federal law after the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Now, the thought was all this potential new wealth could be used to fuel further unrest.
While the Mormons may have had some local authority in the region in the beginning, this was soon challenged by all the people rushing in seeking their fortunes. This new, predominantly non-Mormon population wasn't too keen on the Mormon way of business, and tensions between the two groups quickly ratcheted up.
Compounding this situation was the other major factor, a more national one. The 1850s were a time of turmoil in the U.S. as addressing slavery in the South and its potential expansion in the West had reached a fever pitch. With the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the South seceded and the Civil War erupted.
All the silver spilling out of the ground had created a bit of controversy and a whole lot of concern. Keeping this land and this wealth in Union hands became a top priority. So, pro-Union leadership was quickly installed, and then the Utah Territory was split, with the western half becoming the Nevada Territory in 1861.
The boundaries for this new territory were smaller than what we know of as the Nevada of today. The eastern border used to be further west, and the southern border did not go down to the Colorado River, but over the next decade, Nevada would grow in both directions. For our concerns as highpointers, neither of those borders was ever going to reach a peak higher than what was on the western side of the territory.
The western border was the more contentious one. Originally, Congress wanted to give Nevada a more natural western boundary, so they were going to clip off part of California, make the border the crest of the Sierra Nevada mountains. If that actually would have happened, then White Mountain Peak, the namesake for the White Mountain Range, would have become Nevada's high point. and Nevada would have moved up to number 5 on the list instead of number 9, and been in the 14er club. But that didn't happen, because in the enacting legislation for the Nevada territory, it was stated that California would have to agree to this loss of land. And it had occurred to the Californians that there was gold on the western side of the Sierras, then perhaps there was gold on the eastern slope as well. So, knowing full well that Congress was in no position to argue or push back, California said no. So Nevada's western border became the already established eastern border that was put into play when California became a state, and the legislation for that reads as thus.
The boundary of the state of California shall be as follows. Commencing at the point of intersection of 42nd degree of north latitude with the 120th degree of longitude west from Greenwich, and running south on the line of said 120th degree of west longitude until it intersects the 39th degree of north latitude, thence running in a straight line in a southeasterly direction to the river Colorado, at a point where it intersects the 35th degree of north latitude.
It's the second part of that legislation that gives Nevada its distinctive appearance. And it also tells us why the high point is where it is. Now, there's a few other states out there that have man-made diagonal borders, but none of them are to the length of Nevada's. And while it may look quite simple on a map, it's anything but. And one of the things that makes it so complex is due to one of the tools we use to determine our physical location on the planet, longitude. And to understand longitude, we have to take a look at time.
Latitude and longitude, to put it simply, are how we find where our physical position is on Earth. These days, satellites and global positioning systems have made it commonplace, and pretty much anybody with a smartphone and decent signal can pinpoint their location. But despite seeming ubiquitous in today's world, to get here required some of the greatest minds in world history and the development and later refinement of whole new branches of technology.
Of the two, latitude is the easier to determine, and humans have had it figured out for millennia. That's because latitude relies on points of reference in space, and the Earth conveniently comes equipped with ones for both night and day, the stars and the sun. Once Eratosthenes had figured out the tilt of the Earth in 234 BC, accurately calculating your latitude, whether north or south of the equator, became a rather straightforward affair. Longitude, though, well, longitude's a completely different beast altogether, because it doesn't rely on points of reference in space. No, longitude relies on something a bit more ephemeral: time.
The Earth spins 360 degrees over 23 hours and 56 seconds, so about 15 degrees an hour, 1 degree every 4 minutes. At the equator, this is a speed of about 1,040 miles an hour. As you move north or south to the poles, the speed slows down.
To give you sort of a sense on just how drastic this could be, consider this. If your clock is off by just a second, your measurement could be off by 1/4 of a mile. To make this work, you need precise and accurate timepieces. Now, the concept isn't actually anything new. Hipparchus, a Greek astronomer, first proposed the idea over 2,000 years ago in 127 BC. Unfortunately for Hipparchus, though, timepieces at then were primitive at best, so his theory was never able to be put to the test.
Figuring out longitude for both land and sea was one of the great scientific achievements of the Enlightenment. Some of the greatest minds of the time worked on this problem, including such giants as Isaac Newton and Galileo. In 1657, the pendulum clock arrived on the scene. Now, there was a mechanical timepiece that kept time accurately enough to make the detailed measurements that were necessary.
Simply put, to calculate longitude, you take one clock and you set it to the time of a known point of longitude, the most famous being Greenwich Mean Time, 0 degrees prime meridian. Then you take your other clock and you set it to your local time. Now, by comparing the two times, you can determine your point of longitude.
It would be the famous astronomer and mathematician Giovanni Cassini who would be the first to prove this in 1670 on a trip to the West Indies.
So, while the problem of determining longitude, at least for land, had been solved, there are still some variables to consider, and that brings us all the way back to Nevada's 400-mile-long diagonal border. It's actually quite complex to survey, and part of the reason is because latitude and longitude are both shifting as you move up and down that border. And on top of that, so's the speed of the Earth. It being faster, the more south you are. Then you have to figure in the curvature of the Earth itself. Even if we were going to survey this on more gentle terrain, it would be quite a feat. But in this rugged wilderness, with 19th century technology, it would prove to be an incredible challenge.
Nevada achieved statehood in 1864, but its borders weren't settled. It'd grow almost a third to the east and south, and its western border would be contested. Surveying it proved to be a difficult enough task that it took 3 decades and 5 separate attempts before both California and Nevada actually agreed to the boundary. Though it wouldn't be completely legally settled until 1980. At one point, with one of the early surveys, Boundary Peak was actually considered part of California. But by the end of the 19th century, additional surveys had corrected the state line to lay more in the path of its present location.
The western border that Nevada ended up with would be an authoritative set of lines that cut right through the landscape with no regard to, say, natural boundaries. Truth be told, if Boundary Peak wasn't the state high point, most people would probably just pass it on by.
If that early survey had been accepted, then Wheeler Peak over in Great Basin National Park, the tallest independent mountain in the state, would have been the Nevada high point. While Wheeler Peak lost out on that title, it can take comfort in knowing that in the minds of more than a few climbers, it's viewed as the more interesting peak. What Nevada did end up with was part of a mountain. This state high point is in a small group of states where the high point is not actually the tallest point on the mountain or physical feature it is found on. Boundary Peak is actually a sub-peak to the taller Montgomery Peak that lies just over there and stands about 300 feet taller. Shift the border a few seconds of time, and Montgomery Peak could well have been the Silver State High Point.
The mining boom was a huge deal in this area. And if you actually have the time, one of the things that you can do is explore some of these old ghost towns in the area, remnants of those halcyon days. And while those towns may have faded away, mining in Nevada, it never did. Gold continues to be pulled out of the earth this very day, now joined by other metals necessary for our modern world, like lithium and beryllium. And one final thing about mining in Nevada. While Nevada's nickname is the Silver State, compliments of the Comstock lode, the truth is perhaps a more appropriate nickname would have been the Gold State. Because after 1878, silver took a permanent back seat to gold mining, with more tonnage of the latter being pulled out every year since.
Once you turn off US Highway 6, the drive to the Queens Mine trailhead along the Forest Service roads can be a bit rough, and you'll want to take care. Along the way, you'll pass the remnants of this area's mining heritage. Most drivers will want to stop at the Queens Mine area to park, but if you have a four-wheel drive vehicle with enough clearance and good off-road driving skills, you may be able to make it to Kennedy Point. But proceed with caution.
Once you reach Kennedy Point, you need to come up the hill of that dirt road, and you'll come across this old wilderness register. This is your Boundary Peak Queens Mine trailhead marker. Now, a bit of notice before you step off on this 4.5 mile out. It's 9 miles round trip. This is a strenuous hike. I can't tell you enough that you have to be prepared for it. You will be exposed the entire route. There is no water points anywhere along it, so bring plenty of it. I am bringing 4 liters, and I also drank a liter before stepping off. Dress appropriately. Once you're out there, you're going to be isolated and remote. So without further ado, now that we've had all those warnings, let's go check it out.
The hike up Boundary Peak from Queens Mine can be divided into 3 parts. From the trailhead, you'll make your way up a gradual ascent, skirt a bristlecone pine forest, and cross over a slope. You'll then follow the trail as it descends down towards a saddle. The route is well traveled and easy to hike. Plus, you have the added benefit of being able to see where you are going. You'll want to enjoy this because this is, by far, the most pleasant part of your journey. The second part may be the most difficult, particularly mentally. There's a lot of loose scree here, and at times it can feel you are losing a step for every two you take. Stay focused, because it is easy to slip here. In addition, the trail can be difficult to follow. Regardless, keep working your way up the incline. A word of caution: while this can be difficult going up, for some, it may be even more challenging coming down, as gravity, momentum, and exhaustion combine to make for a tricky descent. Trekking poles shall prove themselves invaluable here.
Boundary Peak is a place that's going to teach you patience and persistence. It's not straightforward. Technically, I mean, it's fairly easy, but there has some challenges. And the first one is the scree. This is a place where it feels almost like for every 2 steps you take, you slide back 1 step. And it gets mentally and physically exhausting. But I'm making good progress moving up the mountain, and hopefully be at the top soon. Let's keep going. Once you start out of the saddle and you come up Boundary, or you come up the first part, it's rough. You grab a lot of elevation quick. Going through the scree, you always feel like you're sort of losing ground. Bring poles, it is essential. And then once you get to this full summit, then you see the real obstacles ahead of you. The first part looks relatively straightforward, but then you're on the final ascent, and there's several obstacles on the way. All right, so we're moving up. We've come to the first obstacle. I'll take a picture and show it to you guys and splice it in. But honestly, just as steep as the first bit, but, and this is huge, there's less of the loose scree, less of that loose rock. So this hike, right now it's easier to get some gain, and you don't feel like you're slipping back. It's still there, don't get me wrong, but there's less of it, and man, it makes all the difference. All right, so we've worked our way through the bigger obstacle heading up, and we're still climbing. Remember when I said, yeah, it'll get easier? That was a total lie. All you can do is keep going up. A little bit of scrambling here and there, but nothing too bad if you take your time and watch where you put your holds and where you plant your feet. Later. One of the things you need to consider when climbing up Boundary Peak is the fact that this is one of those peaks that feels like it's just as hard to get down the thing as it is to get up it. That loose scree and that loose debris really makes slippage a serious concern. So bring those trekking poles, because they could quite literally save your life.
The third section can look intimidating, but it surprisingly isn't as tough as the part you just trekked through. There are several obstacles you'll need to negotiate around as you head to the top. The key is stay close to the ridgeline, take your time, and remember 3 points of contact as you work around the larger rocks. With a bit of perseverance, you'll soon be at the summit.
And here we are on the summit of Boundary Peak, the rooftop of Nevada, coming in at 13,147 feet, makes this the 9th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Scott Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it, and I'll see you soon.
you.